Well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I know it's late in the afternoon, and this is always a bit of a slog, even in such wonderful surroundings as these. But I do think that we have a very interesting topic to discuss this afternoon. It's one of the most contentious issues on the European political agenda at the moment. Maybe not quite as contentious as the refugee question. That's where everybody else is right now, I guess. So we're going to be discussing, as you know, the European defense cooperation, a symbol of the future of European integration, question mark. And to discuss that with me today are in no particular order. I'm going to start to my left here with Filomena Chirico, who's an advisor to the Commission Vice President Katainen on foreign policy. She's a member of the cabinet there. She's worked very intensively on the European Defense Fund, which, as many of you probably know, was established last year to fund defense research, development, and acquisition going forward. To my right is Alice Bion-Galland, a policy fellow at the European Defense Program. She's an expert in the question of transatlantic burden sharing, and also on Europeans' military shortfalls, which I think is one of the key issues we'll be discussing today. When it comes to European strategic autonomy, she advises Europe to stop talking and start planning. She believes that despite the current tensions with the US, that the United States will remain a guarantor of Europe's security for the next decades, which is certainly a controversial view these days when you read some of the tweets of the incumbent US president. To my far right, just on the panel, not on the political spectrum, is Stephen Blockmans, who many of you probably know. He's the head of EU foreign policy at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. He's sort of the agent provocateur of the think tank community there. He says the EU funds currently available will fail to create the big bang the Union needs to create a military-industrial complex. To Stephen's left is Bram Vranken, who is a campaigner and researcher for a Belgium peace organization whose name I will not attempt to pronounce. And Bram takes the complete opposite view. Bram is worried that the evolution of a military-industrial complex is exactly the danger now in Europe. He says that the European Defense Fund signifies an unprecedented acceleration in the militarization of the European Union. The only one who stands to benefit from it is the arms industry, he says. And finally, to my far left is Jan Machacek, a Czech commentator and a chairman of the Institute for Politics and Society, which is affiliated with the ANO party, or movement as it prefers to be called. He's also the guitarist of a rock group, I understand, yes, called Garage, which means garage, as you might suspect, in Czech. And Jan, for those of you who know him, is known for being a spirited contributor to debates on Czech public radio, from what I understand. So let's hope no furniture gets broken this afternoon. But we look forward to a spirited debate. I would also like to say I would really welcome your questions as we get along. Slido is on, as you know, so feel free to ask any questions via Slido. We also have a poll that will be going up that I would encourage you to participate in. And of course, we'll take questions from the audience a little bit later. But just to get things going, maybe just start with you, Stephen. A year ago, we had the announcement of the European Defense Fund last year. We had PESCO announced last year. And yet today, a year later, we're still talking about whether or not Germany is going to reach the 2% target by 2030, maybe. There are various other initiatives that have sprung up. We heard yesterday about the rapid defense force that Emmanuel Macron wants to put into action, and the Germans appear to be now reluctantly agreeing to that. But the overall impression, I think, that one could get from all of these initiatives is that the European defense policy is not becoming more coherent, it's becoming less coherent with all of these various initiatives. Where do you think this is going? Is this a reaction to Trump that, that people just seem to be scurrying off into different directions, and at some point, we will arrive at a more common approach? Or is this just a recipe for disaster in the coming years in terms of European security policy?
And I thought I was the agent provocateur. It's true. There's been a flurry of activity to which you alluded. In fact, so much in the last year and a half to 2 years that this is potentially, the biggest growth area of European integration when compared, to some of the other domains. To just briefly map out where we stand, I think there are 4 pillars one can distinguish. There's, of course, the age-old EU-NATO cooperation, and with the Warsaw Declaration, a renewed impetus was given to streamline basically at the bureaucratic level cooperation between the 2 Brussels-based institutions, the ones that didn't used to talk to one another, are increasingly doing so. And so 42 plus another 34 projects have been developed in mainly streamlining that coordination. I think a second strand, one that you alluded to, is one driven by the member states themselves. Collectively, now 25 that have joined PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation in the area of defense, cooperation and integration, and they're developing, for the moment, 17 projects, which were on the shelf anyway, but soon, hopefully more ambitious projects in order to beef up the European Union capacities in the defense field. The European Commission has come in with its own, and that's the third pillar, set of initiatives under its Defense Action Plan, and there I think you need to situate the European Defense Fund, which as a co-financing mechanism could help speed up some of the projects which PESCO member states are developing. An additional element to that action plan is, of course, on the industrial side, much more the natural competence area of the European Commission, where you see work progressing towards a single market for defense. A fourth pillar, perhaps at least, is one you alluded to, which is the European Intervention Initiative, or as catchily referred to these days as EI2, which is Macron's baby, as launched in the Sorbonne speech. More or less just pitched out there at the same moment, more or less, when PESCO was developing. A bit of a disturbance, really, but built on the premise that an ad hoc coalition of member states should be able to have the operational capacity to have expeditionary warfare potential. And indeed, the declaration that Macron and Merkel yesterday issued speaks about the German alignment with that initiative, as long as it comes as close as possible to PESCO. So I think that's more or less the framework. Is this splintering of initiatives? Perhaps. I mean, who has the overall coherence, the view on what's happening? Because indeed, you have all these initiatives now being developed and weaving a fabric, basically, which could be very tight in the future, but which could also quickly unravel if there is no central leadership and oversight over these developments. Ideally, the High Representative / Vice President of the European Commission would be the one overseeing those activities, in combination, of course, with the NATO Secretary General.
Right, and the operative word there is ideally, and yesterday I think declaration out of the meeting in Meseberg outside of Berlin was, as so often is the case with these declarations, it's like a beautiful sports car, and you think, wow, this is really amazing, and then you go and you open the hood, and there's no engine in it. Alice, just coming to you on this point, there's a lot of talk, as Stephen has just laid out here, across all of these initiatives. Are these just paper tigers, or do you think this is something that is really going to, in the long term, when we look down the road, 10, 20 years down the road, we'll look back and say, this was really the beginning of European strategic autonomy?
Well, I think that these initiatives definitely have potentials, and also they need to be considered as a group because they function together. You have cards that informs the capabilities that member states of the EU need, and that they can then procure together. And then you can come up with PESCO projects and have them financed by the EDF. So I think we shouldn't look at one tool specifically, but more as how the entire dynamic works together. I think there is indeed good potential on this. I think that it won't be enough for European strategic autonomy as a whole, but then it also depends on how you define European strategic autonomy, whether it's EU strategic autonomy or more Europe-wide, which would also include NATO to a certain extent and would include post-Brexit UK, which is something that I guess we'll be discussing later. So I think that these tools that the EU Commission has been putting on the table for member states to use and take ownership of are very useful, and they're creating a good dynamic. But then once again, these are more about capabilities and common procurement and encouraging member states to procure more together. But this is not really about the operational side, and it's not necessarily about fostering strategic culture, which is, as you just indicated, what the sort of European intervention initiative, which would be outside of EU and outside of NATO structure, is aimed at doing. So I think it's going in the right direction. It's a very encouraging piece, but it's part of a broader dynamic, I think.
Filomena, coming to you on this, your boss has said that this defense push, is the beginning of Europe starting to determine its own destiny. To Elise's point, how do you define this question of, within the Commission now, the question of strategic autonomy in Europe? Is that with the United States or without the United States?
I think we said it since the beginning, a stronger EU in defense, which takes into its hands the future and the protection of its citizens, is in full cooperation with its allies, is with NATO. A stronger EU in a stronger NATO means a stronger NATO. So it's the activities that we have been performing in the Commission in terms of the particular the European Defence Fund, but there are others, which one has not been mentioned yet, the military mobility initiative. For example, we have an action plan which highlights the actions that the EU can do to help a project which started off in the NATO context, for example. So it's not really a contradiction to see that the EU gets its destiny in its hands and keeps its strong ties within the North Atlantic Alliance. So that is the context in which we are operating. Then if you take the European Defence Fund itself, it's a tool, as both Alice and Stephen have said, to have a European-wide support for developing capabilities cross-border with more member states cooperating with each other. And if we do a step back, I mean, what we are talking about here is a market in which, or a sector actually, in which even the specifications for socks for soldiers are determined nationally. And now the project that we are pursuing with the European Defence Fund is to have them actually doing research, development, and in the future possibly acquisitions together.
So why do we need PESCO on top of that? Why doesn't the European Defence Fund just evolve into this? Why do we need to add another sort of acronym onto this?
The PESCO is the broader structure in which member states have decided to cooperate in a more intense way. And although I mean, it's 25 member states.
I know what it is, but why is it necessary? I mean, given what you said and given the, the Commission's goals on defense, why do we need another, sort of competing organization?
It's not even competing. It's even broader than that. PESCO is not only about capabilities. It's also about developing other factors together and other interventions together. And for example, one thing is clear that not all PESCO projects will be eligible for funding with the EDF, for example. But we have created, and also to take back your previous question, like everybody's going all over the place with all these initiatives. We have injected the coordination mechanisms, such as the Defense Fund can fund PESCO projects. They get additional funding. Some PESCO projects we have taken up, like military mobility, which comes from NATO, and then parts of PESCO. So it's all going to be coordinated together, and the Council asked some months ago the High Representatives to actually ensure that the capability, for what concerns capability development, this is done in a concerted and in a coordinated way. So in this sense, because we shouldn't forget that priorities and choices and decisions are taken by Member States. So they will decide the priorities, they will decide what goes into PESCO, and on the basis of the priorities also how and which sectors or initiatives the European Defence Fund is going to be able to support.
Bram, when you hear all of this talk about spending, billions on defense and setting up new rapid reaction forces to parachute into Africa and other places, you must be quite worried as somebody who thinks that Europe should be spending nothing on defense. What is your case for not having organizations like PESCO, like the European Defence Fund and so forth? How do you think Europe should handle security?
I think one of the main problems at the moment is that there is a lack of foreign policy. So there is no common EU foreign policy. So the question is, first, so the Commission wants to develop common capabilities, but what are these going to be used for? Because you don't develop defense for the sake of defense. You develop defense capabilities in order to strengthen your foreign policy. So there have been some crises during the last years in Libya, in Syria, and Iraq. The question I have is...
Ukraine. The question I have is, how will these capabilities which the Commission proposes to develop, how will they specifically lead to more security? Because this is not an evident case. You can't just say, okay, we'll develop the capabilities and this will automatically lead to more security. Second of all, I think there are several problems with the European Defence Fund. So first of all, what is almost never mentioned by the European Commission or the European Defence Agency is arms exports and arms export controls. I think this is really the elephant in the room, because these technologies, these military technologies, will be exported in time. But why is that a bad thing?
So if you see at the moment what is happening in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I think it's very clear that the European Union or EU member states are fueling one of the worst humanitarian crises of this moment. So we need to make sure that if the EU funds military research, that we make sure that this technology doesn't end up in conflict areas, doesn't end up in the wrong hands. But I see very little willingness among policymakers at the moment to really discuss this. And this is an important discussion to have, because if you have multinational countries together developing weapons, who will be the responsible for the control of the export of these weapons? This is, I think, an issue which is not solved at all.
Well, to help us solve it, Jan, you come from a country which is often very skeptical of what's going on in Brussels. Not to say that it's Eurosceptic, but that often is critical of much of the kinds of things that we're talking about here this afternoon. What is the view from Central Europe and specifically from Prague on all of these initiatives? Obviously, for your country and the neighboring countries, joining NATO was a real rite of passage, was a huge priority at the time. How do you feel now when you see all of the attention being paid to these sort of Europe-wide initiatives?
Okay, thank you. I will give you my opinion. I don't know if it's an opinion of typical Central European or typical Czech citizens.
We'll pretend that it is.
Well, I don't even think that normal people are much interested in some PESCO. They probably have never heard of it, right? Like so I would mention some Czech specifics later on, before the. Or I can start with it if you demand it. But before when we were waiting for coming to the panel, you said like you would also like to know our attitudes towards Russian danger, possibly. So I think that there are certainly not any pro-Russian country or a Russian Trojan horse or whatever. I think our position is perfectly derived from our historical experience. We were not part of the Soviet Union like Baltic countries. Our country wasn't destroyed by Russians as Russians did or Soviets did together with Germans. So we have a different experience in Poland. But we have an experience of Soviet occupation of 1968. So I still believe that most of the population is not still anyhow enthusiastic about Russia. We have a president who is controversial in this, and sometimes I would say mainly provoking with some things, but this is not the main reason he was elected to the office, I would say. And to give you example of recent cases, after Skripal's poisoning in Britain, we sent home 3 Russian diplomats, which is quite a lot for mid-sized countries, because much bigger countries send home 4 Russian diplomats. So
but you have a lot more here, right?
Sorry?
There are a lot more Russian diplomats here.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but anyway, it's for the size of the country, it was quite clear message. And secondly, in case of this Russian hacker Nikulin, which was very much demanded by the U.S. prosecutors and U.S. government, he was also sent to the U.S. or so. As far as the behavior of the government, which is decisive, I believe that we act and function normally. With NATO, so this is more on my opinion, that I believe that NATO is sort of like the most forgotten miracle in Europe. I think it's a perfectly functioning organization. Maybe it doesn't look like that on the summit where presidents like, or controversial presidents like our president or US president meet, but on the lower levels, it's absolutely professionally functioning organization. And only trouble, or the main trouble it has, that member states should fulfill their obligation of these 2% and the structure of these 2%, because it's not about 2% only. You know that there is a very important how much you invest and how much you spend on personnel, etc. So I think PESCO is okay, but the main priority is to strengthen NATO and to increase defense spending within NATO, and PESCO and all other initiatives should be only the pillar which is absolutely compatible with NATO and supporting NATO. You may wonder why I say that NATO is perfectly professional organization. Perfect. So I think that we can compare it with the EU as such, or with the European Commission, or with troubles Europe is facing. This front, you have this endless emergency summits and everything is decided at the last moment at 5 o'clock in the morning. I wouldn't like to see our European defense being organized in this messy and chaotic wave like the migration or the Eurozone is, and I certainly wouldn't like to see European defense being organized by some or being supervised by some European commissioner or something.
Right.
I also think, which is very important, and I think it's important to, it wasn't mentioned here, that Britain is absolutely crucial for the defense of Europe, and we should also discuss what if you create some European structures or if you create PESCO, what's going to be the role of Britain, because precisely because Britain is leaving European Union, we should strengthen its role in the defense of Europe, because Britain has a mighty army, it spends money on defense, it is a nuclear power even though it is derived from the US one, etc. So it's a topic in itself. So let's think how to keep Britain within any discussion on European defense.
I'd like to come to that question of Britain and also come back to something that you said, Jan, about NATO being perfect. I guess we wouldn't really know or won't really know until we really need NATO, right? But it's a fair point. Why do we need all of these European initiatives if, as Jan said, NATO is so perfect and NATO includes the UK, you live in the UK, why not just continue with the status quo?
Well, I think that the EU and NATO are doing different things that are complementary. And I think that today NATO recognizes that it also needs the EU to be able to protect Europe better. And that the EU has some assets that are very useful for the security of Europe, and there are things that NATO cannot create itself. So we're talking about military mobility, for instance, which is an area in which the EU can actually bring an added value, because it is about renewing transport infrastructure in Europe or standardizing military border procedures. And these are things on which NATO doesn't have the power, because it's not about the military itself. And this is some type of regulation where the EU actually has a very good added value, which is something that NATO has been recognizing, and that the US has been pressing the EU and NATO to collaborate on that issue. And a second thing that I would like to add is that the biggest added value of the EU getting involved in defense, and that of the Commission becoming an actor in the defense field, is the Commission's regulatory approach and the Commission's money, because encouraging common procurement and putting money on the table to encourage member states to do research together, to have common procurements with common requirements, that is something that only the EU is able to do today. And I would just like to add that the Commission won't be owning any capabilities. It would be encouraging common research and common procurement, but only the member states would be owning these capabilities. So I feel like these are two different approaches, and the EU and NATO are complementary, but there is a clear division of labor in the sense that when you read the EU global strategy, it's made clear that the EU recognizes that collective defense, and I'm sort of anticipating on one of the questions here, but that collective defense is the prerogative of NATO for member states that are part of the alliance. So I think there is at the same time a clear division of labor, and also areas in which the two organizations recognize that they both have a benefit in working together. And I think this is where we should put all of the political will and the political effort.
Stephen, is this a good sort of division of labor between NATO and the EU with all of these organizations, especially without the UK being in the EU going forward?
Well, ideally they would work complementary. But I think they're two...
But what do you think the role of the UK will be going forward? This is another big question mark, right? In terms of European security outside of NATO.
Well, the UK could well be the bridge, of course, between NATO and the EU, but I think there are more strategic issues at play. On the point that Jan made, I'm not a great expert of NATO. I wouldn't speak so authoritatively on it, but having spoken to two previous NATO Secretary Generals, they would readily admit, how much is wrong with the organization, in fact, how it doesn't function. So it's certainly not as rosy as has been pictured. But leaving that aside, I think there's a general EU interest which is emerging, which is different from that entertained by a Trump-led White House or by an Erdogan-led government in Ankara. And the European Union collectively, hopefully, ought to be able to serve its own strategic interests at home, below, in defense terms, below the threshold of Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, well understood, but also abroad in expeditionary sense, where those interests ought to be served in order to protect European citizens and Europe collectively.
I would like to come quickly to one of the Slido questions, which is how do we overcome the national industries lobby and achieve greater harmonization of military procurement within the EU? Would you like to address that, Bram? How do you overcome this question of the powerful military lobbies, which, as you say, they might be exporting to places like Saudi Arabia, as many of the German defense contractors do, but on the other hand, they're creating a lot of jobs, well-paying jobs, and that's what Europe needs. That's a strong argument in these debates.
I think it's a complex question, but to pick in on your comments about jobs, I think that there is no good economic argument for more defense spending, because this has been studied extensively. And most studies conclude that defense spending is not economically more beneficial than spending in other areas. So I think the jobs argument is not the best argument to make. I think the reason why the defense lobby is so strong is that states consider it as a strategic sector. And I don't see how, I think the defense fund at the moment is mainly serving national interests, because it's clear that these member states are only going to buy into the program if they can get some money out of it. So I think the defense fund is mainly tailored to interest of national industries lobbies, to the national defense industries, and we'll have to see if they're, I don't think the defense fund is the way to overcome this kind of national lobby.
Let's ask Philomena about that. Is that a fair assessment of the defense fund? I suspect that you'll think not. But how do you deal with this question of the national lobbies, which is a real problem, obviously, because every country, it's easy to say, as everyone does, as the Commission does, and everybody, there are, I don't know, 20 different types of Jeeps in the EU, and you can break it down to, the number of machine guns, and, there are various things to look at there. But how do you move beyond that, really? And especially, for the Commission, what role can the Commission play here in saying, look, we need to standardize all of this, or, at least within the EU?
I would start recalling something once was said to me, which is that it's not surprising that defense is so difficult to get together, defense from different countries and from different sides of Europe, because their job description is to protect the status quo. So to get them to change is against their nature in a way. And yet, where are we now? To start from, there was also your question before to the audience whether we need more or less defense spending. That's a question that at the Commission we have the luxury not to have to answer, because what we are the way we can help is to spend better. If member states with the resources that are being freed up by spending better, they want to spend more, they want to invest more into defense, that's their choice, as will always be. So our contribution is to make things more efficient. That's what the Commission can do in the current treaty framework, in the current institutional framework in Europe. Then how do we go beyond the national lobbies. That's the question. This is a European, what we have proposed is a true European instrument, meaning you need cross-border cooperation or you don't get the support of the fund. We had proposed originally 3 companies from 2 member states. Now the standard is to have a minimum of 3 companies from 3 different member states to participate. So the end including SMEs, possibly SMEs from different value chains, supply chains, so to create a true European supply chain, to precisely go beyond the national boundaries which exist. So starting from there, starting from research, because that's where we're starting from the lowest level of investment in technologies, then going again into prototypes, into developing so closer to the market. And the next step, and that we are still working on this, is we announced also in the Defense Action Plan, and it's the Defense Fund communication of last year, what we call the financial toolbox, so to give to countries, to member states, to government, the possibility of purchasing or procuring together. So to save, in a very simple way, just to save money because you purchase more. But there are much more ways to achieve better results and more efficient spending in this way. So that's when it comes to the full range of capability development. And then procurement markets. Procurement markets are still very much national. We have a few directives to try to harmonize that. We are going to make them work as much as possible until they reach their limit, and then we'll see if there is room to actually go further beyond what has already been achieved. But even there, I mean, in the procurement markets, I would even argue that Europe is a more open market than other jurisdictions, actually.
Which will remain anonymous. Alice, coming to you on this, you know a lot about the capabilities of the Europeans as it stands. Do you think that something like the European Defence Fund, as it's now structured and with the resources that it has, can really make a dent in this deficit that is there in terms of capabilities, or do we need to see something much more bold?
Well, I think that it depends how it's used, which I guess is a very vague answer, but I mean, the money that the Commission is putting on the table for the European Defence Fund, it's a very important amount of money, especially coming from an actor that wasn't involved in defence.
How much money are we talking about just for the audience altogether?
About 5 points.
Well, we have just presented a program for 13 billion euros over the next 7 years, but it has to go through member states.
13 billion over 7 years.
Yeah. Plus 5 billion for military mobility.
Yeah.
And just to put that into context, Germany spends now just under 40 billion euros per year on defense. And just a few months ago, Donald Trump announced that the United States was going to increase its defense budget, this is just the increase, by $60 billion per year. So just to put these numbers into sort of context.
And I mean, I think those numbers are very useful to keep in mind, because when you hear, 13 billion for the European Defence Fund, it's a lot of money, and it will definitely make the EU one of the actors for research and development. But it's not enough money to deal the European capability problem. It's just to encourage member states that want to do more and to spend better together. So I do think that it won't be, as sort of you're arguing, it won't be the breakthrough that would solve European capability shortfalls. And I think that this is also not the point. And here, when we talk about European capabilities and the things to prioritize, basically Europeans still very heavily depend on the United States for very basic capabilities, key enablers that are needed for most operations and deployment. And I think this is the point that I make when I say that sort of whether we want it or not, we will depend on the United States for the short and medium term, because even if
you said decades, so medium term.
Yeah, decade. Because I mean, procurement projects and big procurement, it takes a long time. It takes a long time to agree. It takes a long time to come up with common requirements, and then to fund it, and then to have the capabilities delivered to you. And I think this is why the argument is that we need to start working on it seriously now. And this is what the European Defence Fund can help with. But then it depends what type of capabilities it funds. If it funds key enablers that are needed for EU missions, for NATO missions, for national missions, then that's great. But it's about it being used for what Europeans really need. And I think that's one of the sort of criticism about PESCO and the first batch of PESCO projects, is that they're not ambitious enough at the moment to solve the capabilities problem. So we're waiting for a second batch of projects that will hopefully deal with more core issues of what Europe really lacks. But this is not really the case now. But once again, the Commission has delivered, and it's up to member states to decide whether they're using the tools or not.
Jan, you've outed yourself as a big fan of NATO here. What role do you think that the U.S. Should play here? I mean, you sort of signaled that you think that, yes, Europe should continue on with all of these various, this alphabet soup of initiatives that's going on here, but that the core should remain NATO. But the real question there, though, is what role should the United States play long-term in European security?
Okay, I will respond it, but I will also react on what Stephen said, like that it might be the opposite. It depends like how you measure it and what you measure. If you would measure NATO based on what Donald Trump used to say about it, that it's obsolete, so then I would say, okay, NATO is probably not in a very good shape. If you would compare it with, as I said, like with the way the Eurozone is managed or migration crisis in Europe is managed, then it is, to me, very professional. It has a line of command, it has a planning on many stages, it has experts, and I spent some time there. It has experts who know, it's my experience that these experts know what they talk about perfectly. They don't have different opinions or particular things. So it's, of course, finances is a problem because member states are not fulfilling their obligations, but otherwise it is an organization which has a history, whereas almost everything the European Union does is still in a stage of some kind of an experiment or a project, but this is an organization which has a history of functioning and some kind of delivery. So that's,
would you
that's
rather
one
have,
thing.
let me just ask about that. Would you rather have NATO troops on the eastern flank or European troops? This is actually a Slido question.
Absolutely, I am glad they are there. I would like to mention, as far as the procurement, the biggest trouble to speak about Czech Republic, for instance, is that it is extremely risky for politicians in power to decide about any important procurement, because history of our ministers of defense is that most of them in last 15 years were somehow criminally prosecuted or convicted or still are. So if there is a question how should we tame the ambitions of industrial lobby, etc., so perhaps the biggest trouble is that if you decide something, those who lose always complain. They have some connections to police, whatever. So it's very complicated that our politicians and especially ministers of defense are, by nature, would you like to end up in prison for deciding buying something. So it's, and I don't have an easy way out. Like if of course you can have a minister
well, they can
of
stop
defense
taking bribes, right?
Well, it's not proven actually. Not in some of it is proven, some of it is just a suspicion, and it might be a matter of perhaps some investigative units being suspicious. So it's not very few of these cases ended up with a politician being really convicted and going and his case proven. So this is very complicated, and it's very complicated in all post-communist countries. We just have some first-hand experience with it here. But with the role of the US, I think that that's the reality. We are dependent on the US. It's gonna if we want to be independent, it's gonna take a long time. And plus, I think that the EU should have an ambition to combine agendas while negotiating with the US, and I don't have to be myself happy about American president, but he is the reality. He might be here 2.5 years, or he might be 6.5 years. He's a transactional president. He started these tariffs on steel, aluminum, maybe in few In 2 weeks we will have tariffs on cars. We will see, and I think that also not only because US technology is superior, we should, besides PESCO, we should also think to merge some agendas and say we will buy more American guns because that Trump would, and you will drop these tariffs on this and that, because that's the way he is, and that's the reality that he is here. So, and it would help to balance these trade imbalances, which are also clearly here, that Germany and even EU as such has has a big trade surplus with the US, so it should be somehow dealt. But I am afraid that no one in the EU, and in this I'm absolutely skeptical, is able to manage these agendas while negotiating with the US. That there is no one in Europe who could say we would buy more of your guns. Japanese can do it, Koreans can do it, but EU as such cannot do it, right? Like so, but so it would. Plus, it's not against PESCO. I think that if we would really seriously decide on increasing defense spending, that we should. It's actually also it could be in national interest of all European countries. It would be good for our industries, for our research and development. You can demand of all kinds of offsets and technology, and Europe should also look at it in this way. And the very last thing, it was with European capabilities, it was Angela Merkel who killed this potential merger of BAE and ASD or whatever
EDS.
Airbus these days. And the reason were like jobs in Germany or some kind of a nationalism, whatever. But
Well, coming to the, I've tried to avoid spending too much time on President Trump, but since his name was mentioned, might as well come back to the point. Stephen, has he been a positive factor in this debate about European security, do you think, or more of a negative force? Because you could argue, as the German defense minister has done, that without Trump really kind of putting on the pressure as he's done over the past year and a half, that PESCO probably would have never happened. Is that a fair assessment?
It probably is. It's only one of the drivers, though. I think Carl Bildt called it the BPT factor, the Brexit, Putin, Trump factor. You could add a few more letters, perhaps, to that as negative impetuses for the European member states, primarily, not so much the Commission, but the member states to come to realize that they have to do more together through PESCO, with the help eventually of the EDF. But in fact, I mean, they are budgeting under their projects. These cooperative projects on their own, so not even counting on what the EDF might actually provide in co-financing, 20-30% for PESCO members. What is ironic is that the US has, of course, long insisted that Europe keep up its own pants and stabilize its neighborhood so that the US could focus elsewhere. It's ironic to come to realize that it is exactly one of Trump's ambassadors to NATO who would then suggest that the US might be interested in a piece of the pie and get access to the EDF as well. And in fact, this ties in with two of the questions here, which are posed by Slido, or on Slido rather. How open should the EU be towards third countries' participation in European defense cooperation? I think there the member states have been very clear that there's no way that EU general budget will be used for those countries who do not pay into the system. This is not just the US.
It would also be the UK.
But also the UK to a certain extent, of course, if we don't know what the
with exceptions.
What the conclusion of the exit talks and the future framework negotiations are, but for the moment there's only relevance there to the EEA countries. who pre-enter the system, who are, the best neighbors we could possibly think of.
Bram, just to come back to you on this question, I mean, listening to this discussion, it does sound like, this is a train that is already in motion, that all of this is going to happen in one way or another. What does, someone, from your background and the initiative that you represent, what do you feel you can do at this stage? Because there was also a question about, well, in terms of security, should Europe be focusing on sort of non-military aspects of security? Do you see any real scope for that now, given the environment, given the worries about Russia, given the worries about the U.S. disengaging and so forth, or is this just something that, you're going to be up there, but you and your allies, warning about this, but it's pretty much inevitable at this point, isn't it?
So yeah, I think it's ironic that despite all the talk about by the EU about comprehensive security, that actually these new steps are militarizing the way that we look at security situations, and that the EU is increasingly looking for military answers to certain problems, such as the migration crisis, which is being looked at through a military lens almost. So I think a good example of this is the EU has a fund for conflict prevention, which is called the Instrument Contributing to Peace and Stability. And since a couple of years, this fund has been opened up to also provide equipment to armies in third countries. So I think even where there is a sort of civilian conflict prevention look at conflicts or funds for conflict prevention, these are being increasingly under strain and pressure from a sort of militarizing look at how to solve security issues.
So these are hard days for the peaceniks in Europe, it sounds like.
Well, I think it's something worldwide. Military expenditure has never been this high since the end of the Cold War. Actually, nobody is saying it, but actually we're in a new...
You just did.
Come again?
You just did. I would like to take some questions from the audience if there are any. I know Slido's been great, but it's always good to hear from people personally if anybody has a question. Don't be shy. We've got one here, a couple here. The woman in the fourth row, please.
Thank you. I'm a little worried about all the talk about defense fund and Russia being the main kind of actor that gets into the conversation, while we have a very interesting NATO member who currently has 3.9 million refugees within its borders. It arranged a deal with the EU and...
Referring to Turkey.
Yes. And I'm wondering, is it really Russia that we should be worried about when we're talking about European defense, about European security, about European safety, and about European borders? And I don't want to get into history, but I think we should remind ourselves a few very key roles Russia has played in the European history and in the military events in Europe. And I'm wondering, isn't our attention a little bit misguided? So, and that's a question to all of you. I think it's something that we should not avoid as a conversation, because it is indeed a fact that some of the refugee crises in Europe could have been prevented by a NATO member.
Well, let's take up that question. It's an interesting question. Turkey is a country that's taken in over 3 million refugees because of the Syrian war, which it didn't start. It's taken in exponentially more refugees, even on a per capita basis, than Germany or any other country in Europe. Russia is a country that is suspected of contributing to the chemical attack recently in Syria. It supports the Assad regime. It also annexed the Crimea, as we know, and is waging a war a few hundred miles from here, if you will, in the eastern Ukraine. Are we wrong to be worried about Russia? Should we focus our attention on Turkey, Stephen?
I think you've just answered the question. I mean, you gave all the reasons why we should be worried about, Russia's aggressive posture. We've seen, the first naked land grab by Russia in 2014. We've seen the destabilization which goes on. I mean, there's a war going on in Europe, which is, channeled through the open border from Russia. And you mentioned the others. I mean, we have an attack
I didn't mention that it's
UK.
destabilizing other countries' elections as well.
And there was the Skripal case, and I mean, there's a long list.
I think the question was, should we be more worried about Turkey and Turkey's role?
Well, some other actors other than Russia, because there are other military actors out there that might be much more serious problem for Europe and could act in much more sudden way if we keep focusing on a single actor, which is not to say that there is no danger there, and that there hasn't been some serious problems with our relationship with Russia, but I think that we should not exclude other problems that might be quite high on EU security.
Fair enough. Does anybody else have worries about? I mean, there are other countries aside from Turkey one could be concerned about.
Well, I think Turkey still is a main member of NATO. It's still an our ally, whatever we think about the development there. Refugee crisis is a humanitarian crisis. It's a police issue. It's an issue of social affairs as far as the integration of migrants is concerned, etc. But it's not at the moment primarily a military issue. The trouble is, if you speak about Europe, what is Europe? Inside the European Union and inside NATO, you have the countries like Baltic countries, which were members of the Soviet Union, which were occupied for a very long time and which have significant Russian minorities. And I don't want to speak for a long time, but it just speaks on itself. Look at official Russian military doctrine. It's written there that Russia preserves her right to protect minorities protect Russian minorities in bordering countries. So, and in case it's necessary, and other issues like that. So it's, I don't think we have to be worried, but we should be very careful. And Russia is as former US President Barack Obama said, it's a regional power dangerous to its neighbors, which I would kind of agree, but it's not only regional power, it's a nuclear power. And so that's the reality.
Okay, we have another question here in the front row, please.
Thank you, Martin Michelo from Europeum in Prague. Apparently the US is also concerned with Turkey because Congress just blocked the delivery of F-35s to Turkey over concerns that Turkey would be procuring the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. So this is also something, within the alliance that is problematic, but we're not here to talk about the alliance. I wanted to quiz our panelists on the interplay between the European Intervention Initiative and the ill-fated battle groups of the European Union, because this is one of the big conversations, that the European Intervention Initiative would be able to quickly enter a situation that requires military presence, and eventually down the line that battle groups would be able to take over in one format or the other. Do you see this as being possible? Do we, as Europeans, have enough integrated military planning that we could actually do that? My second question is, we're talking about money a lot. Unfortunately, there's no one from the industry on the panel, but I remember last year the CEO of SAB saying that if the Europeans were actually to all spend 2% by 2024, as they pledged at the NATO Wealth Summit, the defense industry would not be able to respond to this demand. Concretely, what does this mean? Does this mean that, like the French and the Germans, who when they do bilateral procurements, we're going to buy American? Or are we basically simply resolved to buy an American? Because I think this is an important question in the short to midterm. And finally, one last one, since I have the privilege of the mic. is what are the hotspots that you expect European Union militaries in multinational formats to be going into the near future, because this is already something that we have to think about. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's try to pick that apart. Do you want to take
I can take the question on the European Intervention Initiative. I think the whole point of the French proposal for a European Intervention Initiative that would be organized outside of the EU and outside of NATO is specifically to avoid the problem that the EU battle group has had, which is that it's been operational since 2007, but it's never been deployed under an EU flag because there's never been a political consensus and political will to do it. And I think this also fits into what PESCO is, and the fact that PESCO was originally supposed to be an avant-garde of member states, willing and able member states that wanted to do more together in the field of defense. We now have a 25 member states avant-garde, so that's a very positive thing, but it also means that there has been a sort of a trade-off between being ambitious and exclusive to being more inclusive. And this has been sort of the Franco-German arrangement on this. But I think the European Intervention Initiative also has to be seen as something that PESCO isn't, something that the EU battle group can provide, which for me hints at the fact that the EU isn't the framework for deployment and operations at the moment, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be or that it won't be, but that right now the added value of the EU is about capability development and common procurement, bringing member states together, but that when you want rapid reaction force, it's aimed at efficiency, it's easier to do it with willing and able member states that have committed to doing it outside of institutional structures, rather than waiting for sort of all of the EU member states to agree on doing something, which has proven quite problematic when it comes to the battle group.
Okay, we had another question. I'll come to the audience again in a second, but there was a question about U.S. this issue of procurement, and I realize you're not sitting here representing the NATO Council on the 2% issue, but just generally speaking, this problem of being able to, through European sources, to supply this much equipment, as it were, is that realistic? Because even though your fund is very specific to Europe, you have to think about what countries are spending outside of the European dimension on a national level. I mean, is this something? Does something need to be done more here? I guess this is the question, to develop a military industrial complex.
That's a very important point, actually, because we've been mentioning the role of third countries, NATO allies, already within the European Defence Fund, actually, even before getting to the procurement, because in the latest agreement which was reached by the Council and the Parliament on the pilot, let's call it, on European Industrial Development Programme, and then was taken up in the European Defence Fund, which we just proposed a week ago, there is room to have participations of countries for exceptionally and on a derogation from third countries. So it's not that we are, in principle, we are funding projects which are handled and developed by European companies, which are controlled by European hands, but there is a derogation provided that this still protects the security interest of the EU. That's and the member states, obviously, but that's which is security of supply, which is sensitive information and IPR. So it's not exactly that we would only procure, that we would only invest into consortia with only European companies to start with. When it comes to procurement, then the decisions are taken again at member states level. So if a technology is better, probably would be still procured, and until the technology is better, would still procured outside, unless security interest would be endangered. That's the general approach that that the member states are using for procuring then the technologies. When it comes to the industry and the point that the industry might not be able to actually supply it, I mean, the defense industry is more complicated than being European. Now, the Finnish industry is strongly cooperating with the Norwegian industry, so if we are outside of the EU. The Italian or the Swedish industries are cooperating a lot, or have very strong links with the American industry. So it's not exactly like a European or EU within European or EU boundaries that we are talking about. So we have reflected, for what concerns us, the realities of this in the European Defence Fund. For the follow-up procurement, then it's still maybe in the future member states might actually go in the direction of agree a bit more on a more common approach, but for that we need member states' decision on this. As for the export point that Bram raised at the beginning, that's something that member states have to agree to do together, but for the future.
Okay. That sounds like that's going to remain a big problem. Just quickly, Stephen, maybe on this question of hotspots, the European Defence Initiative. You know, France is obviously already in places like Mali and places like Niger, I believe. Where's next on this tour of hotspots?
Well, I was going to say it was inspired, of course, by Mali. The French intervention there, so the Sahel is an obvious region, but I think it stretches all the way to the Horn of Africa and potentially, you know, into the Arabian Peninsula. Whether or not, you know, and this was a question earlier on, we would see EU military forces acting on the eastern flank, you know, this side of the border or beyond it. I don't see that happening very, very quickly, simply because of the geopolitical forces at play.
Okay, there were a number of other questions now. Let me take this gentleman here in the middle.
Thank you very much indeed for an interesting discussion. Benjamin Tallis of the Institute of International Relations here in Prague. I have what is in some ways an old question, but I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on it in light of the renewed enthusiasm for EU defence integration in recent times. Doesn't focusing on defence and the harder aspects of security not risk undercutting the EU's unique identity as an international and European actor? Particularly, it strikes me that it seems to fail to learn the lessons of Europe's past and indeed learn the lessons of what the EU's unique selling point is as a facilitator and an encourager of interaction and interdependence, of getting people to meet each other for trade, for leisure, etc., etc. But moreover, to providing frameworks to manage that integration, particularly under conditions of globalization. So which all helps to create cohesive societies and so on and so forth, which also happen to be the best defense against hybrid threats, etc. So would the panel agree that actually by prioritizing hard security aspects at a time when the gains of integration seem to be under threat from various angles, by seeking effectively an easy way out to the troubles of integration, the EU is potentially actually undercutting its own future and can also potentially alienate NATO as well? Thank you.
Oh, that's a good question. I know what Bram thinks about that, so we'll go to maybe Jan on that question. Is the EU undermining its future by focusing too much on this question of hard power?
EU? Well, simply, because of the acoustics, I have troubles to understand sometimes, so there is this echo, so didn't understand everything. So I think it's compatible with what I said, like that we have NATO for hard power, and I agree that we should have also some action forces, whatever, why not? I definitely think that we should try include Britain in our defense capabilities, whether it's EU or NATO, but we should try to have Britain inside. But I think that EU has different purposes, and we should stick to NATO as far as hard power is concerned.
Okay, so you're in agreement. A question here in the second row from the gentleman.
Ivo Kaplan, Union of European Federalists. I would like to ask you, because Monica Frassoni said yesterday that everything is in Europe at stake, and I agree with her.
Sorry, everything in Europe is?
At stake, in dangers.
It always is.
In dangers, it's for a long time. But now I think the situation around has been changed. The USA is another, India is becoming a nuclear power, China is too big economy, and all together with Russia and Turkey, it's a little bit exploding combination. So EU, on my opinion, should have its armed forces. And nobody told, even Macron in this European intervention initiative, that we have some new soldiers now, that there should be the building of capacities on the paper, on the planning. That is the issue. And the United States wants Europe to protect themselves. So I don't understand this debate, excluding a deputy from the Commission, what it's about, because it's really now Europe is in a very hard situation, and we should do something. And we see Germany that they are now waiting for Bayern elections. So that is my question. What we can do just now, in next 3, 4, 5 months, to prepare really the December summit of European Council, which will decide on accepting the European intervention initiative, or if somebody knows what will be the substitution prepared by Germany to this initiative of President Macron. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That'll have to be the last question, I'm afraid, because we're out of time. Elise, I'll let you answer that as the resident expert on the defense initiative. It seemed that yesterday that Merkel had given sort of a quasi green light to the whole thing. Will it be all done and dusted by December, do you think?
No, I think this European Intervention Initiative is President Macron's baby. He made that speeches at the Sorbonne saying that Europe needed more strategic convergence, and that basically given all the threats, and we talked about Russia, we also, I mean, if you ask people in the Baltic country, they'll say that Russia is number one. If you ask the French, they'll say, let's look at the Sahel and at the southern neighborhood. So I'm not really worried about Europe focusing only on one threat. I'm worried about us having to deal with so many different threats that we just can't really agree on what to prioritize and what to do together. And I think that in that instance, I'm always really careful when we talk about European defense and European defense cooperation to get the vocab right, because we're talking about Europe, not the EU necessarily. And I think that now that the Commission is becoming an actor involved in defense, that doesn't mean that the EU is necessarily the go-to place for defense cooperation in Europe. Europe has a very rich patchwork of defense cooperation. You have binational, unilateral, ad hoc coalition, the EU, NATO, etc. And because defense is a prerogative of the state and it's intergovernmental, it will likely remain that way for the long term, I think. So I think it's about making the EU a strong and a credible actor in the field, but also not expecting the EU to deal with all of these European issues. And we can't expect the EU to deal on its own with the problems that European defense is facing. And I think that's why initiatives like the European Intervention Initiative is sort of the French pragmatic approach of saying, okay, now we need to do something, and if you're willing and able, and we can sort of do something together, and sort of bypassing the fact that at the EU level you need all member states to agree on something, and this is no longer the way forward. And even yesterday at the Franco-German Ministerial Council, you even had the German government saying that we should start thinking about abandoning the unanimity vote in matters of foreign affairs at the EU. So I think this is the way things are going at the moment, acknowledging that defense is a field where we cannot make decisions at 27, and this is not good or bad, it's just the way it is, the way it's always been, and so we should also adjust our expectations as to that, I think.
As ever in the EU or in Europe, adjusting expectations is very important. A rocky road ahead for European strategic autonomy. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you for all of your questions. The results of the poll, by the way, as you may have seen, 67% of those who responded, I believe that the EU should be spending more on defense, not less. Sorry about that, Bram. But, you know, better luck next time. We'll be back next year. Thank you all again, and wish you all a very pleasant evening.